When an elderly woman walked into a luxurious restaurant, no one suspected her quiet presence would expose a shocking truth and bring the entire room to a standstill. The late afternoon sun poured through the grand windows of Brenton's Bistro, a prestigious fine dining restaurant nestled in the heart of Portland, Oregon. Known for its elegant ambiance, the bistro buzzed with soft chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the gentle melodies of a live pianist in the corner. It was a place where people came to celebrate milestones or seal high-stakes business deals. As the doors swung open, an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor walked in, her presence quiet yet commanding. She moved with purpose, her steps deliberate, despite the years etched into her graceful frame. Dressed in a navy coat adorned with intricate embroidery, she carried a small handbag neatly tucked under her arm. Her calm demeanor and poised posture drew a few curious glances from nearby diners. The hostess, a young woman with a polished smile, greeted Mrs. Eleanor, but there was something in her tone, a subtle hesitation, almost imperceptible but unmistakable to those paying attention. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, glancing momentarily over her shoulder as if distracted. "Yes, under the name Eleanor White," she replied in a steady voice. After checking the list, the hostess nodded and led Mrs. Eleanor to a small table near the kitchen, far from the restaurant's prime seating areas. The placement felt deliberate, but Mrs. Eleanor said nothing. She quietly took her seat, placing her hands gently on the table as she scanned the menu. "My friend?" she asked, as she scanned the menu. About her, the usual hum of the restaurant continued, but something felt different. There was a faint tension in the air, an undercurrent that would soon shift the course of the evening and leave everyone in the room questioning their assumptions. Mrs. Eleanor sat quietly at her table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Though she was placed near the kitchen, a spot often reserved for last-minute reservations or less favored patrons, her demeanor didn't waver. The faint aroma of grilled seafood and fresh herbs drifted from the open kitchen doors, blending with the low hum of conversation and the pianist's soft tunes. Moments passed, then minutes. The waiter assigned to her section, Todd, was a tall man in his late 20s, with a confident stride and an easygoing smile. But as he moved from table to table, engaging with diners and taking orders, his attitude shifted whenever he passed Mrs. Eleanor. His steps quickened, his gaze never quite landing on her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Todd approached her table, holding a small notepad in his hand. His smile was thin, almost forced, and his tone bordered on abrupt. "Sorry for the wait," he said briskly. "We're really busy tonight. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Mrs. Eleanor nodded gracefully, her voice calm and steady. "Take your time." But as Todd walked away, it became evident that her table wasn't a priority. Nearby, a young couple seated just moments ago received their drinks almost immediately, the waiter chatting amicably with them as he poured wine. At another table, a family of 4 was served steaming plates of pasta, each dish delivered with a flourish. From the corner of her eye, Mrs. Eleanor noticed subtle glances in her direction. A woman seated 2 tables away leaned toward her dining companion and whispered, her gaze flickering toward Eleanor with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Another diner, a middle-aged man in a suit, furrowed his brow as though trying to place why she seemed so out of place in the upscale setting. Minutes turned into nearly half an hour, and still, Todd hadn't returned. Mrs. Eleanor's water glass remained empty. Across the room, Todd's cheerful laugh carried as he joked with another table, his tone light and full of ease. Eventually, Todd returned to her table, this time with an air of impatience. His shoulders were stiff, and his smile had disappeared altogether. "Sorry, we're a bit understaffed tonight. Might be a while before I can get to you," he said, his words clipped. Mrs. Eleanor offered him a faint smile, her expression betraying none of the discomfort she surely felt. "I understand," she said simply. He nodded before turning his attention to the meal. She started talking among themselves before looking up sharply at him. Todd barely nodded before walking away, leaving her table as quickly as he had arrived. At a nearby table, a young woman whispered to her partner, "Why hasn't that lady been served yet? She's been sitting there forever." Her partner glanced at Todd, his expression uncertain. "Maybe it's just a mistake," he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Meanwhile, Mrs. Eleanor sat calmly, her hands still folded neatly on the table. Her gaze drifted across the room, taking in the polished decor, the tailored suits, and the flowing dresses of other diners. She had been in spaces like this before. She knew the subtle sting of being overlooked, not outright disrespect, but the kind that lingered in every delayed glance and every ignored request. Todd, however, seemed entirely indifferent. As he passed her table yet again, his tray laden with dishes destined for another group of diners, Mrs. Eleanor gently raised her hand. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice steady and polite. Todd paused, his expression tightening with irritation. "Yes?" he asked, his tone lacking warmth. "I'd like to place my order if you're not too busy," she replied, her calmness unwavering. Todd sighed audibly, glancing around as though searching for an escape. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered, before turning away without waiting for her response. Across the room, the quiet tension grew palpable. Conversations faltered, and more diners began stealing glances toward Mrs. Eleanor's table. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed to piece together the unfairness unfolding before them. Seated at a table near the bar, a man in a crisp navy blazer observed everything with a sharp gaze. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the edge of his glass, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. This man wasn't just another diner, he was the restaurant's owner, Elijah White. Elijah had been quietly watching from the moment his mother walked through the door. He had seen the hostess's hesitance, the unfavorable seating arrangement, and Todd's dismissive behavior. He had also seen his mother's quiet grace, the way she refused to let the treatment provoke her. For now, Elijah remained seated, his jaw tight with restrained anger. He wanted to see how far Todd would take this, how blatantly he would disregard someone he deemed insignificant. But Elijah also knew one thing: this would not go unaddressed. As Todd passed by her table once more, his laughter echoing from a nearby conversation, Mrs. Eleanor glanced at her watch. Her movements were calm, deliberate, as if she were simply passing time. But the tension in the room was undeniable now, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of an impending storm. Elijah White sat at a table near the bar, his half-empty glass of sparkling water resting untouched. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer, he looked every bit the part of a seasoned restaurateur. From his vantage point, he had a clear view of his mother, Mrs. Eleanor, seated near the kitchen. Her quiet composure, despite the dismissive treatment she was receiving, only deepened the knot in his chest. He had designed Brenton's Bistro to be more than just a fine dining establishment. It was a place meant to embody respect, community, and warmth, values instilled in him by the very woman now being ignored at table 12. Mrs. Eleanor wasn't just another patron. She was his anchor, the person who had supported him through years of struggle and reminded him to keep his head high when the odds were against him. Then came Mother's end. Seeing her treated as though she didn't belong in the space he had built felt like a personal betrayal. From across the room, Elijah noted every detail: the way Todd barely glanced in her direction, his casual banter with other tables, and his brisk, dismissive tone whenever he did speak to her. The longer Elijah watched, the harder it became to contain his anger. He had hired Todd because of his supposed charm and professionalism, but now he saw a side of him that was uncomfortably familiar, the kind of arrogance that thrived on assumptions and overlooked the dignity of others. Sitting behind the bar, his fingers tapped rhythmically against the edge of his glass as he replayed the moments in his mind. Todd walking past her table without offering water, his thin smile, the curt tone, and the exaggerated sigh when she politely tried to place her order. Elijah's jaw tightened as he caught the faint smirk Todd exchanged with another server. As if her presence were some sort of joke. He knew he should intervene. The man in him wanted to march across the room and put an end to it immediately. But the leader in him, the one who had spent years cultivating this business, told him to wait. Confronting Todd too soon might give him an excuse to dismiss his behavior as a misunderstanding or claim he was overwhelmed with work. Elijah wanted no room for excuses. Seeing the long line of tourists arriving for the holidays, he knew now was the time to act. As he watched, Elijah's mind drifted back to the countless conversations he'd had with his mother about resilience and dignity. She had always believed in letting people reveal their true character, even when it was painful to witness. Sometimes, you don't need to call someone out right away, she had told him. Their actions will speak louder than anything you could say. And here she was, embodying that philosophy with every graceful movement. She sat patiently, her hands folded neatly on the table, her expression calm. Elijah could tell she wasn't entirely unbothered. Her glances toward her empty water glass, the way she adjusted her watch, betrayed the slightest hints of frustration. But she would never make a scene. That wasn't her way. Around the room, other patrons had begun to notice. A couple whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Mrs. Eleanor and Todd. A man at a nearby table frowned, his gaze lingering on the empty space in front of her. The atmosphere had shifted, the usual hum of lively conversation now tinged with unease. Elijah's anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. He had spent years fighting against this very kind of subtle discrimination, the kind that wasn't loud or overt, but was unmistakably present in the small slights and dismissive gestures. He had thought his restaurant was a safe haven, a space where respect was non-negotiable. Yet, here was his own staff member proving otherwise. Signaling Dana, his manager, Elijah leaned in and spoke under his breath. "Keep an eye on table 12, he said, nodding toward his mother. "Don't intervene yet. I want to see how Todd handles this." Dana hesitated, her eyes scanning the room before she nodded. She could sense the weight of Elijah's tone, calm but firm, carrying the authority of someone deeply disappointed. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze fixed on Todd as he moved around the room with casual indifference. The younger man's cheerful demeanor with other patrons only heightened the contrast. Each laugh, each effortless smile felt like a slap in the face. As his mother raised her hand again to politely call Todd over, Elijah clenched his jaw. His fingers stilled their tapping, his decision crystallizing in his mind. He would let this play out just a little longer, but not much. The storm brewing inside him wouldn't be held back for long. Todd would soon learn that in this restaurant, respect wasn't just a suggestion, it was the foundation. For now, Elijah stayed seated, his resolve firm. He trusted his mother's grace, but he also knew it was his responsibility to step in when the time was right. This wasn't just about Mrs. Eleanor. It was about ensuring that no one, no matter their appearance or background, would ever face this kind of treatment in Brenton's Bistro again. The soft hum of the restaurant had quieted, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. Patrons exchanged uneasy glances as Mrs. Eleanor raised her hand once more, her voice calm but firm as she addressed Todd. "Excuse me," she said, her tone cutting through the murmur of nearby conversations. "I'd like to place my order if you're not too busy." Todd paused mid-step, his shoulders stiffening as if the request were an inconvenience. He turned to her, his expression betraying impatience. "I'll be back in a minute," he muttered dismissively, not even meeting her gaze before walking away. From across the room, Elijah White rose from his seat. His movements were deliberate, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure as he crossed the floor with measured steps. The room seemed to shift as diners turned their heads, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Sitting down, Todd, unaware of Elijah's approach, stood at another table, cracking a joke with a group of patrons who laughed easily. His casual arrogance melted into confusion when he noticed Elijah standing beside him. "Elijah," Todd stammered, forcing a smile, "I didn't know you were here tonight." "I've been here," Elijah said calmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the surrounding tables. "And I've been watching." Todd's smile faltered. "Watching what?" he asked, his voice laced with nervousness. Elijah's eyes flicked toward Mrs. Eleanor's table, where she sat quietly, her gaze steady but unreadable. "Watching you ignore my mother," Elijah said, his voice firm but controlled. "She's been sitting there for nearly 30 minutes without so much as a glass of water, while every other table in your section received your full attention. The color drained from Todd's face as his gaze darted toward Mrs. Eleanor. "Your mother," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Yes, my mother," Elijah replied sharply. "The woman you treated as though she didn't belong here. The woman you thought wasn't worth your time or respect." The restaurant fell into a stunned silence. Even the pianist stopped mid-note, his fingers hovering over the keys. All eyes were now on the confrontation. Todd opened his mouth to speak, but Elijah cut him off. "Save it," he said coldly. "There's no excuse for what you've done, and everyone here has seen it." Elijah turned to Dana, the manager, who had been hovering near the bar, unsure whether to intervene. "Dana," he called, his voice steady. "Take over table 12 immediately. Make sure my mother has everything she needs." Dana nodded quickly, rushing to Mrs. Eleanor's table. She filled the empty water glass and offered her profuse apologies, her hands trembling slightly as she handed Mrs. Eleanor the menu. Elijah turned back to Todd, his expression unreadable, but his tone unyielding. "We'll discuss your future here later," he said. "For now, you're done for the day. Go home." Todd stood frozen, his face a mix of humiliation and regret. Slowly he untied his apron, his movements stiff and reluctant. Without a word, he walked toward the door, his exit punctuated by the heavy swing of the restaurant's glass door as it closed behind him. The silence lingered for a moment before Elijah approached his mother's table. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his stern demeanor softening into something warmer. "You okay, Mom?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Eleanor smiled faintly, reaching out to pat his hand. "I'm fine, son," she said gently. "You handled that well." Elijah exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I should have stepped in sooner," he admitted. "No," she replied, her voice calm. "You let him reveal his character. Sometimes, that's more powerful than confronting someone right away." The room began to stir again, quiet conversations resuming as patrons processed what they had just witnessed. At a nearby table, a young couple leaned toward each other. Curse strained. His hands clutched at his face. Curse clutched at his hands. "I can't believe he treated her like that," the woman whispered, shaking her head. "It makes you wonder how often this happens when no one speaks up." Her partner nodded thoughtfully. "It's not just about what you see, it's about what you're willing to stand up against when it happens." Elijah overheard their exchange as he returned to his seat. Their words stayed with him, a reminder of why he had built Brenton's Bistro in the first place. It wasn't just about the food or the ambiance. It was about creating a space where everyone felt respected and valued. "Hello?" he asked Ryan. Meanwhile, Dana continued attending to Mrs. Eleanor, her apologies heartfelt as she personally ensured her meal was served promptly. The other staff members moved more attentively, the weight of the incident lingering in their minds. When Elijah finally returned to his table, his mother looked at him with a mixture of pride and understanding. "You've built something beautiful here, Elijah," she said softly. "But remember, it's not just about the decor or the menu. It's about how people feel when they walk through those doors." Elijah nodded, his expression serious. "I know, Mom. I'll make sure this never happens again." As the restaurant returned to its usual hum of activity, the lesson lingered in the air, etched into the minds of everyone present. Respect wasn't just a courtesy, it was the foundation of everything. For Todd, for the staff, and for the patrons who had witnessed it all, the night was a stark reminder of the power of dignity and the importance of standing against injustice. The evening air outside Brenton's Bistro was crisp as Elijah walked his mother, Mrs. Eleanor, to the door. The glow from the restaurant's grand windows illuminated their faces, reflecting the warmth of the light inside. Elijah's sharp, composed demeanor softened as he turned to his mother, searching her expression for any lingering hurt. "You okay, Mom?" he asked again, his voice tinged with concern. Mrs. Eleanor smiled gently, her presence as calm and steady as ever. "I'm fine, Elijah. You don't need to worry about me." Elijah sighed, the tension from the night still weighing heavily on him. "I can't believe that happened. I built this place to stand for something better. Respect, inclusivity, fairness. And to see someone treated like you were tonight." He trailed off, shaking his head. Mrs. Eleanor reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Elijah, you've done something incredible here. This restaurant is a testament to your hard work, your vision, and your values. But tonight was a reminder that even the best intentions can falter when others don't share the same commitment to integrity." Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's not enough to create the space. I have to ensure the people here embody what this place stands for. Todd showed me tonight how easy it is for one person to undermine that." Mrs. Eleanor's gaze was steady. "And yet you handled it with grace. You didn't let anger cloud your judgment, and you didn't lower yourself to his level. That's what leadership is about, Elijah. It's not just about making decisions. It's about setting an example." He let her words sink in, the weight of the lesson settling on his shoulders. "You've always taught me to let people reveal their character, but I hate that it came at your expense tonight." Mrs. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Sometimes, moments like these are necessary, not just for the person at fault, but for everyone watching. You gave Todd the chance to show his true self, and you addressed it in a way that taught everyone in that room something important." As they stood together, Elijah glanced back into the restaurant where the remaining staff were quietly working to close for the night. "I need to talk to the team," he said. "This can't just end here." Mrs. Eleanor gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. "Go on. I'll wait for you outside." Inside, Dana had gathered the staff near the bar. Their faces were a mix of solemnity and reflection, the weight of the evening's events evident in their expressions. Elijah approached, his presence commanding the room. His every move betrayed more than self-importance. "Before you all head out tonight," he began, his voice steady, "I want to address what happened." He glanced around, meeting each team member's gaze. "This restaurant isn't just a business to me. It's a reflection of the values my mother taught me: respect, fairness, and kindness. Tonight, those values were tested, and someone I cared deeply about was disrespected in a way that's unacceptable." The staff shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement while others looked down, clearly affected by the gravity of his words. "I know many of you saw what happened," Elijah continued, "and I hope it made you think. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity, no exceptions. It doesn't matter who they are, how they're dressed, or where they're seated. If they're here, they're our guest, and they deserve the same respect as anyone else." Dana stepped forward, her tone serious yet constructive. "We've all had moments where we're stressed, overwhelmed, or distracted. But none of those are excuses for what we saw tonight. It's not just about serving food. It's about creating an experience where everyone feels welcome. That starts with us." Elijah nodded, his expression resolute. "This isn't just about Todd, it's about all of us. What kind of culture do we want to create here? What kind of environment do we want to be proud of? Tonight was a wake-up call not just for Todd, but for me, for Dana, and for every one of us." He paused, letting the message sink in before continuing. "Tomorrow, I'll be holding a team meeting to discuss our values, our expectations, and what it means to work here. If you're not willing to uphold the standard we set tonight, this might not be the right place for you." The room was silent, the weight of Elijah's words resonating deeply. Dana stepped in again, her tone softer now. "We all make mistakes, and we all have room to grow, but we can't grow if we don't acknowledge where we fall short. Let's take tonight as an opportunity to learn and be better, not just for the guests who walk through these doors, but for ourselves." Elijah nodded, his gaze sweeping over the team. "I want this place to be more than just a restaurant. I want it to be a space where people feel seen, respected, and valued. That starts with us. Let's make sure that from now on, we live up to that mission." "We need new team members," Kathlina said. As the team dispersed, their expressions a mix of thoughtfulness and determination, Elijah returned to the door where his mother waited. She smiled warmly as he approached. "You've built something beautiful here, Elijah," she said again. "But remember, it's not just about what you create. It's about how you nurture it, how you protect it, and how you hold yourself and others accountable." Elijah exhaled deeply, the weight of the evening lifting slightly. "Thanks, Mom," he said quietly. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, the lessons of the evening lingered not just for Elijah and his team, but for everyone who had witnessed the quiet strength and unwavering dignity of Mrs. Eleanor. It was a reminder that respect, kindness, and integrity weren't optional. They were the foundation of everything. The evening at Breton's Bistro wasn't just about a meal delayed or a single act of disrespect. It was a reminder of the subtle injustices that can unfold in everyday life situations that often go unnoticed, unchallenged, and, most tragically, uncorrected. But what made this story different was the way it ended, with dignity, accountability, and a lesson for everyone involved. Elijah's decision to confront the behavior head-on wasn't just about defending his mother, Mrs. Eleanor. It was about standing up for the values that should guide us all: respect, kindness, and integrity. By letting the situation unfold, Elijah gave Todd the opportunity to reveal his true character, and while it was painful to watch, it became a powerful teaching moment for the staff, the diners, and everyone else who witnessed it. But this story doesn't end at Breton's Bistro. It extends to all of us. Every day we encounter moments where we can choose to stand up or stay silent, to act with compassion or look the other way. These moments might not be as dramatic or public, but they carry the same weight. How often do we see someone being overlooked or treated unfairly? How often do we recognize the quiet struggles of others and choose not to act? And most importantly, how can we change that? As you think about this story, I invite you to reflect on your own role in similar situations. Would you have spoken up if you saw what happened to Mrs. Eleanor? Would you have let it slide, assuming someone else would handle it? These questions aren't easy, but they're necessary. What Elijah did wasn't easy. It took courage to confront Todd publicly and demand accountability. But it also took grace to approach the situation without anger or unnecessary confrontation. That balance, standing firm while remaining respectful, is what we should all strive for in moments of conflict. The lesson here is simple but profound. Respect and kindness aren't optional. They are the foundation of how we should treat one another, whether in a fine dining restaurant, a casual workplace, or a bustling street corner. And yet, there's an even deeper message. Leadership, like Elijah demonstrated, isn't just about power or authority. It's about taking responsibility, upholding values, and inspiring others to do the same. It's about creating a culture where respect isn't demanded, it's instinctive. So as you leave this story behind, ask yourself, how can I be more like Elijah? How can I create spaces, whether in my home, workplace, or community, where everyone feels valued? And how can I ensure that I'm living up to the principles I expect from others? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who might need a reminder of the power of dignity and empathy. Start a conversation with your friends or family about the moments where we've all fallen short and the opportunities we have to do better. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Real Life Stories. We believe in sharing narratives that inspire reflection, action, and growth. By joining our community, you're not just watching a story, you're becoming part of a movement toward kindness, understanding, and justice. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, how this story made you feel, and what you would have done in Elijah's place. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Let's take the lessons from this story and carry them forward. Because real change doesn't start with someone else, it starts with you. Together, we can make the world a little more just, a little more kind, and a lot more compassionate. Until next time, stay inspired, stay thoughtful, and remember, every action, no matter how small, can make a difference. See you in the next story.